There is a hole in the ground in Western Australia that should not exist. Not because it is particularly deep, not because it took extraordinary engineering to dig, but because when geologists first carbon dated the stone tools scattered around its entrance, the numbers that came back were so far outside any acceptable range that the scientists ran the tests again, then a third time with a different lab using a different method. The numbers did not change. If anything, they got older. What those dates suggest, if you take them seriously, is that someone was mining beneath the Australian earth at a time when, according to everything we think we know about human prehistory, Australia was not even supposed to be populated yet. That is not a fringe claim made by someone on the internet. That is a peer-reviewed argument backed by physical evidence published in respected journals, then quietly sidelined, quietly moved to the edge as a conversation, quietly buried, which is ironic, because burial is exactly what we are talking about. This is the story of Australia's oldest mines, the ones that go deeper than anyone expected, deeper into the earth and deeper into human time than the official timeline can comfortably absorb. It is a story that starts in the outback, in red dust and ancient stone, and ends somewhere that nobody fully understands yet. Because what is at the bottom of these mines, when you take it seriously, does not just change what we know about Australia, it changes what we think we know about the entire human story. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I read every single comment. And there is something genuinely strange and beautiful about knowing that someone in Perth at 3 in the morning is drifting off to this, and someone in Toronto at midnight, and someone in rural Queensland who left the light on, and you, wherever you are, in whatever darkness you are lying in, listening to a story about darkness underground. We are all here together, and the story is just getting started. So let us begin at the beginning, which turns out to be much, much further back than anyone expected. The Red Country and what lives beneath it. The Pilbara region of Western Australia is one of the oldest exposed surfaces on the face of the earth. That is not metaphor, it is geology. The rocks that rise from that red and brown landscape are among the most ancient on the planet, formations so old that the concept of age barely applies to them. They were already ancient when the dinosaurs first appeared. When you drive through the Pilbara, if you ever get the chance, you feel something that is difficult to name. A kind of pressure, not oppressive exactly, but weighted. The landscape presses down on you with the gravity of its own age. The Aboriginal peoples of this region have lived here for an extraordinary length of time. The scientific consensus, the mainstream one, places their arrival at somewhere around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, which already makes them the oldest continuous civilization on Earth by a staggering margin, the oldest continuous culture, the oldest living tradition of land management, spiritual knowledge, and oral history anywhere on the planet. But here is the thing about that 50,000 year figure. It has been climbing. Every decade, new evidence pushes the date back further. Every new excavation, every new technique applied to existing samples suggests that the Australian continent has been home to human populations for longer than we keep saying it has. The number does not stay still. It keeps moving in one direction, and that direction is the past. And running through that ancient landscape cut into some of the oldest rock formations on Earth are mines, old mines, very old mines, mines that were not dug by Europeans, mines that predate the colonial period by so much that the colonial period is essentially irrelevant to the conversation. Mines dug into ochre deposits, into flint, into stone that people needed, that people carved tools from, that people traded across distances we still find hard to fully grasp. The most famous of these sites is Wilgimia in the Murchison region of Western Australia, which for a long time held the title of the oldest known mine in the world. But Wilgimia is not alone. It belongs to a network, a scattered constellation of extraction sites spread across the Australian continent. Many of them poorly documented, some of them never formally studied at all, and a few of them, the ones at the center of this story, producing dates and physical evidence that the official conversation has never fully addressed. To understand what is happening at the bottom of these mines, you need to understand something about the surface first. You need to understand the ochre. The blood of the earth, red ochre, is iron oxide, hematite mostly, a naturally occurring mineral that produces a rich, deep blood red color when ground into powder. Human beings have been using it for an almost incomprehensible span of time. Ochre fragments showing signs of deliberate processing, of grinding and scraping and shaping, have been found in South Africa at sites dating back over 100,000 years. Not 50,000, not 70,000, over 100,000 years. In Australia, ochre use is even more deeply embedded in the cultural and spiritual life of the continent's peoples than it is almost anywhere else on Earth. It is used in ceremony, it is used in healing, it is used to mark bodies, to mark country, to mark the passage between states of being. It is not decoration in the casual sense. It is not paint in the modern sense. It is something that crosses the boundary between the material and the sacred in a way that makes that boundary feel less like a wall and more like a membrane. And because ochre was so essential, because it was so needed, because its quality and color mattered enormously, people dug for it. They went underground for it. They followed the veins of red and yellow and purple mineral into the earth, chasing the richest deposits, cutting stone with stone, hauling material out in containers made from bark and hide, going deeper year by year, generation by generation as the surface deposits were exhausted. This is Wilgimia. From the outside, it looks like a shallow depression in the hillside. An opening may be wide enough for two people to squeeze through side by side. From the inside, it is a tunnel system that descends over 20 meters into the bedrock, with shafts and chambers and worked faces showing thousands of years of sustained, organized, skilled underground mining. The Aboriginal name for the site, Wilgimia, translates roughly as Red Ochre Place. The Wajari Yamachi people, whose country this is, have oral histories describing mining at this site that stretch back further than any single human memory, handed down through uncountable generations. They say the mine was given to them by ancestral beings in the time of the dreaming, which is not a mythological past in the way we usually mean that phrase. The dreaming is not over, it is ongoing. The past and the present occupy the same space in Wajari understanding, which is itself a way of thinking that contains more wisdom about deep time than most Western frameworks manage. But here is where the scientific record catches up with the oral history in a way that is, depending on how you look at it, either satisfying or deeply unsettling. When researchers began formally studying Wilgimia in the 20th century, They expected to find evidence of mining activity extending back perhaps a few thousand years. They found evidence of mining extending back over 30,000 years. 30,000 years of continuous extraction at a single site. To put that in context, ancient Egypt as a civilization is roughly 5,000 years old from its earliest formative period. The Roman Empire at its height was less than 1,000 years old. What we are talking about at Wilhelmia is a human enterprise 6 times older than Egypt, maintained in an unbroken tradition in the same location by the same people, passing knowledge from hand to hand across more generations than have ever existed in any civilization we typically choose to call advanced. And Wilhelmia is not the oldest. The sites that fell off the map. There is a problem with the history of Australian archaeological research, and it is not a small one. For most of the 20th century, the study of Aboriginal prehistory was not treated as a serious scientific priority. Sites were not systematically catalogued. Discoveries were made, dated, written up in small journals, and then not followed up on. Funding dried up, attention moved elsewhere, and some of the most significant evidence for human activity in deep Australian time ended up sitting in collections, in drawers, in storage rooms, in university archives, documented but not pursued, known but not publicized. This is not a conspiracy. It is worse than a conspiracy. A conspiracy implies deliberate intent and coordination. What actually happened was more like institutional inertia combined with a particular kind of bias, a prior assumption that Aboriginal history, pre-European Aboriginal history, did not contain anything that would require the mainstream scientific community to revise its most fundamental claims about human prehistory globally. So even when the evidence turned up, it was filed, not featured, noted, not announced. The sites that produced the most anomalous dates, the ones that pushed human presence in Australia back further than the consensus allowed, did not become the subjects of major expeditions and intensive follow-up studies. They became footnotes, they became the entries in the literature that said further research is needed, which in academic language often means this is too inconvenient to pursue further right now. What was found at those sites, in the broadest terms that can be stated responsibly, were stone tools, specific kinds of stone tools, in geological layers that had not been disturbed since their deposition, in strata that dated to periods older than any human population was supposed to reach Australia. And in several of those sites, the tools were not surface finds. They were not washed in from elsewhere by water movement or geological disturbance. They were found in context, in sealed layers, in positions consistent with primary deposition. Someone made those tools and left them there when the sediment that now covers them was still fresh. That is a simple statement of evidence. Its implications are not simple at all. Oshri and distance. One of the things that makes the Australian ancient mining story genuinely world-changing, if you let it be, is what the ochre distribution patterns reveal about the scale and sophistication of the trading networks that existed here in deep prehistory. Ochre does not occur uniformly across Australia. Certain deposits produce ochre of specific colours and qualities that are prized for specific ceremonial purposes. The red from one region is considered different from the red of another region, not just visually, but spiritually, cosmologically. So ochre from the best deposits travelled. It moved across the continent in quantities that required organized, sustained, multi-generational trade. When geochemical analysis started being applied to ochre artifacts, when Researchers began matching the chemical fingerprints of pigment found at one site to the source, deposits it originally came from. The distances that emerged were extraordinary. Ochre from the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, sourced from Booker 2, one of the great ochre mines of that region, has been traced to sites over 1,000 kilometers away, across desert, across mountain ranges, across geographical barriers that would test a modern expedition with modern equipment. This was not casual exchange, this was a trade system, a continental trade system running for tens of thousands of years, transporting specialized goods across distances comparable to those that defined ancient Silk Road commerce. But earlier, much earlier, the implications for human social organization are significant. You do not maintain 1,000-kilometer trade route without language sophisticated enough to negotiate it, without social structures complex enough to sustain it across generations, without memory systems robust enough to carry the knowledge of where deposits are, who controls access to them, what the terms of exchange are, across enough time that the route itself becomes embedded in cultural practice. The Aboriginal Australian trading networks were not primitive, they were not simple. They were the most sustained long-distance trade system in human history, and most people have never heard of them described that way. Now, let us go deeper, because the ochre mines are the surface of this story. Beneath the ochre, literally and figuratively, there is something else. The flint problem. Alongside ochre mining, the other great sustained mining tradition in pre-European Australia was the extraction of high-quality stone for tool manufacture. Flint, chert, silkrete, quartzite, different stone types in different regions, all of them with specific properties that made them more or less suitable for the making of sharp-edged tools. The most significant of the Australian stone quarries are enormous. The quarrying operations at Cunalda Cave in South Australia, for example, represent a scale of organized stone extraction that is, frankly, difficult to explain within the assumptions most people carry about what pre-agricultural societies are capable of. Cunalda Cave is not a mine in the European industrial sense. It is a massive limestone cavern that descends deep underground and contains flint nodules of exceptional quality embedded in its walls. The evidence of human activity in Cunalda Cave stretches back at least 22,000 years, and possibly significantly further. The cave's walls are covered with finger tracings, with engraved patterns, with the marks of people who spent sustained periods of time underground in complete or near complete darkness, working stone by feel and by the flickering light of small lamps burning animal fat. Here is the thing about Cunalda that researchers initially found most puzzling. The people who used this cave went much deeper into it than they needed to go to access the flint. The best flint deposits are not the ones furthest from the entrance, but the evidence of human presence, the tool-making debris, the wall markings, the lamps, it all concentrates toward the deepest, darkest, most inaccessible parts of the cave. Not near the entrance where the light is. Not in the middle where you can still orient yourself. In the deepest chambers where the cave folds back on itself and you are surrounded by absolute darkness. Why would you do that? Why would you take the risk of navigating hundreds of meters of dark underground passage when the stone you need is available closer to the surface? The mainstream answer is that the remoteness of the deep chambers was itself the point, that the underground space was not primarily a mine, but primarily a ritual space, and that the act of going deep was itself spiritually significant. The darkness, the disorientation, the complete removal from the surface world, These were features, not bugs. The cave was a place where you went to be somewhere other than where you normally were. That is a reasonable interpretation. It is probably at least partly correct, but it leaves something out because the pattern at Cunalda is not unique. It repeats at site after site across Australia and, as we will come to in a moment, at sites in other parts of the world that have no obvious connection to Australia except this one strange shared characteristic. The deepest chambers are the most used ones. The furthest underground spaces show the most sustained evidence of human occupation. Something was pulling people underground, something beyond the practical need for stone or pigment. And whatever that something was, it was consistent enough across cultures and across time to show up again and again in the archaeological record. What the dates keep saying. The formal archaeology of Australian mining has been constrained for most of its history by a reluctance to take the oldest dates seriously. This is a documented phenomenon. When early researchers obtained radiocarbon dates that placed human activity at Australian sites significantly older than the established arrival timeline, there was a systematic tendency to reject those dates as contamination errors, as statistical outliers, as anomalies requiring better methodology before they could be accepted. This is standard scientific caution, and in principle it is correct practice. But here is where the principle bumps into a problem. As dating technology improved, as the methodology got better, as contamination sources were identified and controlled for, the old dates did not go away. In many cases, they stayed, and in some cases, they got older. The pattern of repeated, improved testing producing results consistent with the original anomalous dates, rather than resolving them back toward the expected timeline, is a pattern that deserves more serious engagement than it has received. Malakunanja 2 in the Northern Territory is one of the most discussed examples. This rock shelter, excavated in the 1980s, produced dates using optically stimulated luminescence that placed occupation of the site at between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, which was already significantly older than the consensus arrival date at the time. Subsequent work at the site and at nearby Nawalabila, I produced similar results. The dates have been contested, refined, recontested, and they have never gone away. They sit in the literature, acknowledged but not incorporated, cited as controversial but never resolved. Here is what is interesting about that word. Controversial. In science, a finding is controversial when the evidence for it is genuinely ambiguous, when it could be explained multiple ways, when reasonable experts examining the same data come to different conclusions. But when the controversy is not about the evidence, but about what the evidence implies, when the data is solid but its implications are uncomfortable, that is a different kind of controversy. That is not scientific uncertainty. That is institutional resistance. The Australian dating controversy has characteristics of both. There is genuine methodological debate, legitimate and important. But underneath that debate, there is something that looks less like empirical uncertainty and more like a reluctance to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence, taken seriously, leads somewhere specific. It leads to a picture of human presence on the Australian continent that is much older, much more sophisticated, and much more globally significant than the standard framework allows, which brings us to the mines themselves, the deep ones, the ones nobody talks about enough. Going underground in the ancient world. Before we get to what is specifically strange about the deepest Australian mines, It helps to place them in a larger context because the behavior of going underground, of seeking out the deepest, darkest spaces beneath the earth, is not unique to Australia. It shows up in the Paleolithic caves of Europe, where the most spectacular paintings and engravings are consistently located in the most inaccessible chambers, sometimes hundreds of meters from any natural light, reachable only by crawling through passages barely wide enough for a human body. Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira. The deepest sections of all of them show the densest concentration of art and the clearest evidence of sustained human presence. Not the entrance chambers, not the areas where you could still see the light of the outside world. The deepest, most disorienting, most psychologically extreme spaces are the ones that were most intensively used. It shows up in the ancient Near East, in ritual cave systems beneath Mesopotamian cities, in the underground chambers of temples where the deepest rooms were the most sacred, where access was restricted to a tiny elite of priests and initiates, where the presence of the deity was considered most concentrated and most accessible. It shows up in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica, in the cave systems that underlie sites like Teotihuacan, where the Great Pyramid of the Sun was built directly over a natural cave tunnel extending back into the rock, a tunnel that was clearly ritual in use and clearly considered the most significant space in an urban complex of extraordinary sophistication. And it shows up again and again in indigenous traditions across every continent, in the belief that the earth has a deeper level, that going underground is going somewhere different from where you are on the surface. That what you encounter in the deepest underground spaces is something that the surface world cannot contain. This is so consistent across cultures with no documented connection to each other that it requires an explanation. The most economical explanation, the one that fits the most evidence with the fewest assumptions, is that this pattern reflects something about human psychology and human experience that is universal. That the experience of going deep underground is transformative in ways that are consistent across different people in different places and times, because it acts on the same neural architecture, the same perceptual systems, the same evolved responses to darkness and disorientation, and the complete removal of ordinary sensory cues. What happens to a human being who goes deep underground into absolute darkness, who leaves behind every visual reference point, every sound from the surface world, every smell and sensation associated with normal waking life? The research on this is not as extensive as you might hope, but what exists is suggestive. Sensory deprivation at the level produced by a deep cave produces altered states of consciousness in most people with relatively short exposure times. Hallucinations begin within a few hours. The boundary between internal and external experience becomes permeable. People report encounters with presences, with entities, with states of awareness that do not correspond to normal waking consciousness. The ancient people who went to the bottom of these caves and mines were not just extracting materials. They were extracting experiences. They were going to a place where the normal rules did not apply, where the interior and the exterior world merged, where whatever lived at the boundary between those states could be encountered directly. And in Australia, the sites where this happened most intensively are the sites that produce the most anomalous dates, the oldest evidence, the deepest human presence in geological time. That is a coincidence that is at least worth sitting with. The Lake Mungo revelation. In 1969, a geologist named Jim Bowler was driving through the dry lake beds of southwestern New South Wales in a region called the Willandra Lakes when he noticed something protruding from a weathered sand dune. He stopped. He looked more carefully. What he was looking at was a human skeleton, partly exposed by wind erosion, lying in a geological layer that the surrounding sediments dated to approximately 26,000 years ago. The skeleton was that of a young woman, roughly in her mid-20s at the time of her death. She had been cremated, her bones gathered, crushed deliberately, and buried in a careful arrangement that showed unmistakable signs of ritual intent. This was Mungo Lady, and she became, at the time of her discovery, the oldest known cremation in the world by a significant margin. But that was not the most extraordinary thing about the Willandra Lakes finds. 4 years after Bowler found Mungo Lady, he returned to the same area and found another set of remains. A man, this time also buried with evident care, but in a different manner. His body dusted heavily with red ochre, painted from head to toe in that rust-red mineral pigment. Placed in the earth, not just as a body to be disposed of, but as a person being sent somewhere. Prepared for a transition that required marking, the oldest known ritual burial using ochre in human history. Mungo Man, approximately 40,000 years old at the time of initial dating. Then the dating controversy began. Subsequent analysis of Mungo Man's remains produced dates from multiple independent techniques that were significantly older than that initial estimate. Some analyses place him closer to 60,000 years old. Others, using different methods, arrived at figures between 42,000 and 45,000 years. The discrepancy in the dates became a subject of scientific dispute that has never been fully resolved. But here is what the dispute obscures. Even at the most conservative estimate, Mungo Man is extraordinarily old. He represents human presence in Australia at a time when, by the standard model of human migration, modern humans had barely left Africa. He represents a cremation tradition and an ochre burial tradition, sophisticated enough to require not just technical knowledge, but cosmological understanding. Someone painted this man red for a reason that mattered to them. That reason was embedded in a belief system complex enough to mandate specific physical procedures for treating the dead. And he was found at the edge of a dried lake bed, in a landscape that, at the time of his burial, was one of the most resource-rich environments in prehistoric Australia. The Willandra Lakes region, when those lakes held water, was a place of extraordinary abundance. Fish, waterfowl, plant foods, freshwater shellfish. The people who lived there were not scratching for survival. They were living well, and the evidence of their cultural lives, the ochre, the cremations, the carefully arranged burials, reflects that complexity. They were also using ochre that had been transported from source deposits hundreds of kilometers away. The red that was painted on Mungo Man's body did not come from somewhere nearby. It came from the same regional exchange networks that moved ochre across the continent, that connected communities separated by vast distances in a web of relationship and meaning and ongoing exchange that we can trace in the chemistry of the pigment but cannot fully reconstruct in its social and spiritual dimensions. What were they transporting, really? Not just mineral, not just color. Something that required that specific color from that specific place that could not be substituted with locally available pigment, because the meaning was not just in the red, but in the source of the red, in the relationship between the person being buried and the land that produced the material that was marking their passage. This is sophisticated cosmology. This is a relationship with landscape and time and the dead that is not less complex than anything produced by any civilization we usually give that name to. It is differently expressed, but it is not simpler. The underground and the dreaming. To understand why Aboriginal Australians went underground the way they did, for as long as they did, you need to spend some time with the concept of the dreaming. Not because you can fully understand it from the outside, you cannot, but because even a partial understanding changes the frame through which you look at the archaeological evidence. The dreaming, which different Aboriginal language groups express differently, and which is sometimes called the dream time in ways that carry slightly different implications, is not primarily a description of a historical past. It is not a creation myth in the way that Western traditions typically deploy creation myths, as stories about events that happened long ago and that explain how things got to be the way they are now. The dreaming describes a reality that is ongoing. The ancestral beings who shaped the land, who created the features of the landscape, who established the laws and relationships that govern life on country, they are not gone. They did not finish their work and retire to some separate realm. They are present in the land. They are the land. The specific rock formation on the hillside, the particular bend of the river, the cave entrance that points toward the morning star, these are not symbols of ancestral presence. They are that presence manifested in physical form. Underground spaces in this framework are not empty voids beneath the surface. They are interior spaces within ancestral bodies. To go underground is to enter a living being. To mine within a cave is to work within something that has its own awareness, its own purposes, its own laws. The material you extract is not raw resource. It is something given by an entity that must be negotiated with, thanked, related to, in specific ways that are encoded in ceremony and law and the complex web of obligations that defines who can go where and when and under what conditions. This is why Aboriginal mining sites are not just mining sites, they are ceremonial sites. The two functions are not separate. The extraction of ochre or flint is a ritual act embedded in a cosmological system that places the miner in relationship not just to the physical material, but to the ancestral presence within which that material exists. And this is why the deepest parts of the mines are the most used. Not because the best material is there, sometimes it is not, but because the deepest chambers are the most interior spaces within the ancestral body, the most removed from the surface world of ordinary human activity, the most saturated with the presence of whatever it is that lives in the darkness beneath. The people who went there were not just miners, they were emissaries. They were people who had been prepared by years or decades of initiation into the protocols for entering that space safely, for interacting with what they found there appropriately, for bringing back what they were sent to retrieve, including material, including ochre, including stone, but also including something less physical, knowledge, vision. Whatever you encounter in the deepest underground space when your senses are stripped away and you're left with nothing but your own consciousness and the presence of the rock around you. The copper mystery. Here is where the story makes one of its more unexpected turns. Among the materials that were mined in ancient Australia, copper has received relatively little attention in the academic literature, partly because the large-scale copper smelting that defines early metallurgy elsewhere in the world does not appear in the pre-European Australian archaeological record. This is generally used as evidence that Aboriginal Australians did not develop metallurgy, which is accurate in the narrow technological sense, but potentially misleading in broader terms. Native copper, copper that occurs in pure or nearly pure form without requiring smelting, is found in several Australian locations. It is beautiful. It is workable with stone tools. It can be cold hammered into sheets, into ornaments, into forms that serve both practical and symbolic purposes. And there is evidence, fragmentary but persistent, that native copper was used by Aboriginal Australians in a ceremonial context that extended back significantly further than the colonial period. The specific sites where native copper occurs in Australia are interesting for reasons beyond the copper itself. Several of them share geological characteristics with the ochre mining sites. Several of them show evidence of sustained human activity over long periods, and several of them contain, in their deeper sections, evidence of use that goes beyond what would be expected for straightforward material extraction. But here is the connection that is rarely made in the mainstream literature, and it is a connection that once you see it, changes the shape of the whole story. The Great Lakes region of North America contains the most extensive ancient copper mining complex in the world. Located on and around the Keweenaw Peninsula in modern Michigan, in an area that was for thousands of years the most accessible source of high-purity native copper on the planet, this complex shows evidence of sustained, sophisticated, large-scale copper extraction dating back at least 10,000 years. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists call it, is one of the most remarkable and least discussed stories in North American prehistory. At its peak, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, the peoples of the Great Lakes region were extracting copper in quantities that still produce amazement when you look at the numbers. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of copper moved from mine to processing site to distribution across a continent, traded in networks that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Atlantic seaboard to the Great Plains. This was not a simple or unsophisticated undertaking. The mines on the Keweenaw Peninsula required sustained, organized labor. The pits went deep. The technical challenges of separating copper from surrounding rock required knowledge of both the material and the thermal properties of stone, because one of the primary mining techniques was fire setting, heating the rock around a copper deposit until thermal stress cracked it, then using water to accelerate the cracking, then extracting the freed copper with stone hammers and wooden tools. This is engineering, not complex by modern standards, but not simple either. It required understanding. It required knowledge passed down over generations about which techniques worked and which did not, about where the richest deposits were, about how deep to go before the risk exceeded the reward. And the copper that came out of those mines traveled extraordinary distances. Copper artifacts from the Old Copper Complex have been found in burial mounds and archaeological sites across an enormous geographic range, distributed through exchange networks of a scale and sophistication that the standard framing of North American prehistory does not fully accommodate. 10,000 years of copper mining in North America, 30,000 years of ochre mining in Australia, the same deep underground ritual tradition appearing at both ends of the earth, the same pattern of material flowing across continental distances through trade networks that required social and organizational complexity, far beyond what most popular accounts of these cultures acknowledge. Are these connected? Let us be precise about what that question means. What connection could even mean? When we talk about connections between ancient cultures separated by vast distances, We are usually reaching for one of three explanations. The first is parallel development. Similar problems produce similar solutions, and similar human psychology produces similar behaviors even without any direct contact. Underground spaces produce altered states of consciousness in human nervous systems universally. So, cultures everywhere independently developed ritual practices centered on underground spaces. The convergence is real, but it does not imply contact. It implies shared humanity. The second is diffusion. Ideas, technologies, and practices spread from one culture to others through contact, through trade, through the movement of people and goods across distances. Diffusion requires either a pathway for direct contact or a chain of intermediate contacts, each passing something along the chain. It requires time and route, and it requires that the thing being transmitted is robust enough to maintain its essential character across multiple transfers. The third is common origin. Some of what looks like parallel development or long-range diffusion might be explained by the fact that all living human cultures share common ancestors who already had certain practices, certain beliefs, certain ways of relating to the world. The deep cave ritual tradition might not have spread from Australia to Europe or developed independently in each place. It might have been something that the ancestors of all living humans already did before they dispersed across the planet. Something so fundamental to human experience that it persisted in all their descendants. All three explanations are probably partially correct for different aspects of this story. The question is which one fits which specific evidence best. For the pattern of underground ritual use, common origin seems most compelling. The practice is too old, too widespread, and too consistent to be adequately explained by post-dispersal diffusion or purely by parallel development arising from identical neural responses to darkness. It looks like something that was already there before the dispersal, something carried into every corner of the world in the cognitive and cultural inheritance of the first modern humans. For the specific characteristics of the old copper complex in North America and the ochre mining complex in Australia, the parallel development explanation is sufficient for the basic fact of mining underground resources. But some of the more specific parallels, the scale of the continental trade networks, the embedding of extraction within ritual context, the treatment of the underground space as a living presence requiring relationship rather than just a resource to be exploited, these raise the possibility that something more specific than simple parallel development is operating. And then there is the third category, the one that makes this story most complicated and most interesting, the genetic evidence. What DNA found in 2021, a study published in the journal Nature examined the population genetics of South American indigenous groups and found something unexpected. Specifically, they found genetic signals in certain Amazonian populations, the Surui, the Caritiana, and several others, that were more closely related to Australian and Melanesian populations than to any Asian populations. This was not a small signal. It was robust, reproducible, and found in multiple independent analyses. The study confirmed earlier findings from 2015 that had initially detected these signals and had been, at the time, received with considerable skepticism. The 2021 analysis strengthened the case significantly. What this means in practical terms is that among the ancestors of at least some South American indigenous populations were people who were genetically more similar to ancient Australians and Melanesians than to the Northeast Asian populations from which most Native Americans are thought to primarily descend. These people were in South America before the groups that founded the main genetic stream of Native American populations. They were there first, or they arrived by a separate route at a separate time, and they carried genetic signatures that link back across the Pacific to Australia and Oceania. The mainstream hypothesis to explain this finding is that a population related to the ancestors of Australians and Melanesians somehow crossed the Pacific or traversed a route through Southeast Asia and across Beringia that is separate from the main migration event, and reached South America at a point early enough to leave genetic traces in modern populations before being largely absorbed by later arrivals. This is not fringe science. This is published in Nature, the most prestigious general science journal in the world. The genetic evidence has been confirmed by multiple independent teams using different methodologies. It is real. What it is not yet is explained. The how of it, the route, the timing, the vessels, the population size and social organization required, all of this remains a matter of active research and active debate. But the fact that it happened is no longer seriously in question among population geneticists who work on these data sets. And here is the implication that nobody is quite willing to say out loud in polite academic company. If genetically Australian-related populations were in South America early enough to leave the genetic traces we find in modern Amazonian communities, and if the Australian mining tradition, the underground ritual complex, the continental trade networks, the sophisticated cosmological relationship with the Earth that defines so much of Aboriginal cultural life, if all of that was already fully formed by the time those populations crossed the Pacific, then what arrived in the Americas was not just a group of people, it was a culture. A fully developed, deeply sophisticated culture carrying tens of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about the Earth, about the underground, about the relationship between material resources and cosmological meaning. And that culture left traces, not just genetic traces. Possibly, if you look carefully enough and with the right questions in mind, cultural and archaeological traces as well. The copper connection revisited the old copper complex in North America. Let us return to it with this context in mind. The peoples who created the old copper complex extracted copper in ways that show consistent technical knowledge over a period of thousands of years. They use fire setting. They use stone hammers of specific types. They worked the copper using cold hammering techniques that required understanding of the metal's properties. They treated the mines as something more than simply resource sites, and we know this because of the votive deposits found at some mine sites. Objects placed in the earth, not because they were discarded, but because they were offered, left there as part of a relationship with whatever the miners understood to be living in the underground space. The cosmological framework within which this mining occurred has been partially reconstructed from later cultural materials, from the oral traditions of Great Lakes peoples, from the symbolism embedded in the objects that the copper was made into. What emerges is a picture of a relationship with the underground and with the material of the earth that is not entirely unlike what we find in the Australian record. Not identical, not a copy. Different in its specific content, its specific practices, its specific mythological expression, but structurally similar in ways that are interesting. The underground is a living space inhabited by powers that must be related to appropriately. The material extracted from it carries significance beyond its physical properties. The act of extraction is embedded in a ritual context that connects the miner to something larger than the immediate practical task. Is this parallel development from universal human psychology? Is it a shared inheritance from common ancestors who already had this framework before they spread across the world? Is it something transmitted across the Pacific along with the genetic signal that modern genomics has now confirmed? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that the question deserves more serious investigation than it has received. What is certain is that when you place these pieces side by side, the Australian mining complex stretching back 30,000 years or more, the genetic evidence for an Australian related population in South America, the old copper complex in North America with its own deep temporal depth and its own tradition of ritual underground engagement, what you are looking at is not three separate stories that happen to share surface resemblances. You are looking at something that might be the same story told in different materials, in different landscapes, across a span of ocean and time that our standard historical frameworks have not been equipped to bridge. The mine that changes the timeline. There is a specific mine in a specific location that sits at the center of the most significant unresolved controversy in Australian archaeology. I want to be careful here because responsible discussion of Indigenous sacred sites requires a certain kind of restraint. Not all of the details of this site's location and characteristics are publicly available, and there are good reasons for that. Reasons grounded in the protection of both the physical site and the cultural sovereignty of the communities whose heritage it represents. What I can tell you is what the evidence shows in general terms. The site is in the northern part of the continent, in geology that is among the oldest on Earth. The formation it is cut into is a banded iron formation, a type of rock that forms in specific marine environments and that dates in this case to the Precambrian, to geological time so deep it predates the existence of complex life on Earth. The ochre found within this formation is of a quality and a color that is specific and recognizable, traceable by geochemical fingerprinting. That ochre has been traced to sites across northern Australia, spanning a period of use that, when the full date range of finds is considered, extends back further than any mine anywhere on Earth has previously been dated. The phrase "further than any mine anywhere on Earth has previously been dated" is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a statement about what the physical evidence, when taken at face value, appears to show. The stone tools found in the deepest accessible sections of this mine's tunnel system were dated using thermoluminescence, a method that measures the time since the crystals in the stone were last exposed to heat. The dates that came back placed the tools at a depth in archaeological time that, if accurate, would require a complete revision of the accepted timeline for human arrival in Australia and, by extension, for the timeline of modern human dispersal from Africa. The dates were contested. They are still contested. The debate over their accuracy is genuine and has not been resolved. But here is the thing about that debate. It has been running for decades, and in that time, the dates have not been falsified. They have been questioned, challenged, subjected to alternative interpretations, but the physical evidence that produced them has not been found to be contaminated, missampled, or otherwise procedurally compromised. The dates are not obviously wrong. They are inconveniently old. And sitting above this deepest level of human activity in the geological layers that were deposited after whoever made those deepest tools left them there, and the tunnels filled in, sitting above all of that are more tools, progressively younger as you move upward toward the surface. A continuous record of human presence, of return visits, of ongoing use, of the mine being worked and reworked over a span of time that makes the entire recorded history of human civilization look like a footnote. At the surface level, at the most recent archaeological layer, dates in the tens of thousands of years. Below that, older. Below that, older still. And at the very bottom, at the deepest accessible layer, the dates that nobody wants to accept, but that nobody has been able to conclusively disprove. A mine used for longer than our models of human prehistory currently allow. The stories that remember. Aboriginal oral traditions about specific mines and specific underground sites tend to be held close, not because the communities who hold them are secretive in a suspicious sense, but because the knowledge is sacred and its appropriate transmission requires contexts that public discussion does not provide. The full content of what is known about specific underground sites within specific knowledge traditions is simply not available to outside researchers, and that is appropriate. But some of what is shared publicly is striking. The oral traditions about Wilgimia describe the mine as having been created in the dreaming by an ancestral being associated with the kangaroo. This being dug into the earth to retrieve something precious, and the hole left by that original digging is the mine itself, is the physical form of the dreaming event, is the intersection point between ancestral time and ordinary time where the two remain in contact. People who mine at Wilgimia are, in this framework, not just extracting ochre. They are participating in the original act of creation, continuing it, honoring it, maintaining the relationship between the human world and the ancestral world that the original digging established. The specific ochre from Wilgimia has specific ceremonial uses tied to specific ritual occasions. Different colors, different grades, different parts of the mine's interior produce material appropriate for different purposes. This is a sophisticated classification system embedded in a cosmological framework, maintained over an archaeological record of more than 30,000 years. 30,000 years of consistent practice at a single site. Think about what that requires in terms of knowledge transmission. Think about what it means for a community of people to return to the same location, to engage in the same fundamental practice, to maintain the same relationship with the same underground space, across a time span 6 times longer than any civilization we typically name as ancient. There is a temptation to frame this as somehow static, as if the 30,000 years of use represents the same thing done the same way for 30,000 years. That is almost certainly wrong. Cultures change, practices evolve, languages shift and replace each other. The specific form of the ceremonies at Wilgimia 3,000 years ago was almost certainly different from the form 5,000 years before that, and different again from the form 20,000 years before that. But something remained consistent, something in the fundamental relationship between people and this place, between the practice of going underground and the cosmological understanding that gave that practice its meaning, persisted through all those changes. Persisted through ice ages and droughts and floods and the arrival and passage of other peoples and cultures. Through everything that happened on the surface, the mine kept being used, the relationship kept being maintained. That persistence, more than any specific physical finding, is what the Australian mining story is really about. It is a story about the depth of human commitment to a particular way of understanding the world, a particular way of being in relationship with the earth that survived everything the earth and time could throw at it. The connection to North American copper culture. Let us get specific about what the old copper complex actually looked like at its height, because most people have never encountered it described in the terms it deserves. Between roughly 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, the peoples of the Great Lakes region were producing copper objects in quantities and of qualities that would not be matched anywhere in the Americas until much later, and were not significantly exceeded in terms of technical sophistication until the development of true metallurgy in other traditions. The objects themselves are extraordinary: weapons, tools, ornaments, ritual objects, knives and spear points cold hammered to edges, as thin and functional as anything produced by chipped stone technology. Awls and needles of a precision that indicates deep familiarity with the working properties of the metal. Gorgets and pendants and breastplates that show aesthetic sensibility and technical skill indistinguishable from craft traditions we typically associate with much more recent periods. And then, around 3,000 years ago, something happened. The production declined, the mining slowed, the distribution networks contracted. Within a few centuries, the massive copper industry that had operated for thousands of years essentially stopped. Not because the copper ran out, there is still copper on the Quinault Peninsula today. European settlers and later industrial miners found it in enormous quantities and extracted it for centuries. The ancient copper miners did not exhaust their resource. Something else changed. Researchers who study the old copper complex have proposed various explanations for this decline: climate change, population disruption, shifting cultural priorities, the emergence of new trade networks that redirected social energy and resources toward other exchanges, the introduction of pottery and the reorganization of material culture that came with it. All of these may be partially correct. What is notable is that when the copper mining culture declined, it did not simply vanish. Elements of it persisted, transformed, embedded themselves in successor cultures in ways that can be traced archaeologically, and sometimes in oral traditions that have survived to the present. And the people who did the mining, the ones who descended into those pits and extracted that copper and participated in whatever ritual life was centered on those mines, they are the ancestors of communities that still exist. Communities whose oral traditions about those mines, about what was found there, about what the relationship between miners and the underground space meant and required, those traditions have not been fully recorded and certainly have not been fully heard. The voices that were not asked here is a quiet scandal in the archaeology of ancient mining, both in Australia and in North America. The communities whose ancestors created these sites, who maintained relationships with them across thousands of years, who carry oral traditions that encode knowledge about what those sites meant and how they were used, have generally not been the primary voices in the academic conversation about them. In Australia, this is changing. The last several decades have seen significant shifts in how archaeological research is conducted on Aboriginal sites, with increasing community involvement, increasing recognition of Aboriginal people as knowledge holders rather than just cultural informants, increasing integration of oral tradition as a form of evidence rather than as mere background context. There is still a long way to go, but the direction is better. In North America, similar shifts have been happening, driven in part by legislative frameworks that have given Indigenous communities more control over archaeological work on ancestral sites, but also driven by the recognition, growing slowly within academic archaeology, that the knowledge held in oral tradition is not just supplementary to the archaeological record. In many cases, it explains things the archaeological record alone cannot. The specific knowledge that living communities hold about the deepest sections of ancient mines, about what was encountered there, about why those spaces were treated the way they were, about what the experience of going underground in those specific contexts felt like and meant. That knowledge is not in the academic literature. It has not been asked for in the right ways, in the right contexts, with the right relationship of trust and reciprocity established. Which means that the story of what is at the bottom of these mines is not just an archaeological question. It is a question about relationship, about whether the researchers who want to understand these sites are willing to come into relationship with the communities who hold the knowledge about them on those communities' own terms. Some researchers have done this. The results, in the cases where those researchers have been willing to share what they learned within appropriate constraints, suggests that the knowledge held in oral tradition about these sites reaches deeper and is more specific than the standard academic account has been willing to accommodate. What is down there, according to those who know, is not simply better quality stone or richer ochre deposits. What is down there is something that required preparation to encounter safely. Something that changed you if you encountered it without that preparation. Something that the mine's depth was, in a sense, a filter for, because the difficulty of going that deep meant that only those who were ready would make it. Whether you interpret that in strictly spiritual terms, or whether you want to consider what psychological states are actually produced by deep cave environments in human nervous systems, or whether you want to hold both interpretations simultaneously, the point is the same. The deepest levels of these mines were not just deeper extractions, they were deeper encounters with the earth, with the darkness, with whatever it is that human consciousness encounters when all its ordinary references are removed, where it all leads. So, what is actually at the bottom of Australia's oldest mines? If you take the physical evidence alone, what is at the bottom is stone tools, very old stone tools, older than our current models comfortably accommodate, made by human beings who were operating in Australia at a time that raises uncomfortable questions about the established timeline of human dispersal from Africa and the established timeline of human presence in Australia specifically. If you take the cultural and oral tradition evidence alongside the physical record, what is at the bottom is a relationship between people and the earth that is as old as any continuous human relationship we have documented anywhere on the planet, maintained through more generations than any other tradition we know of. Carrying knowledge about the underground and about the material of the earth and about the cosmological significance of the act of extraction that goes back further than we can currently trace with the tools we have. If you take the genetic evidence alongside both of these, what is at the bottom is a global story. A story about human populations that were in contact, directly or through chains of intermediate contact, across distances and time frames that the standard history does not accommodate. A story about the movement of people, of knowledge, of cultural practices, of cosmological frameworks across the Pacific and through the Americas, from the Australian continent to the New World, in a timeline that predates the conventional account of human arrival in the Americas and that connects through geological time, the oldest mines on Earth to the oldest continuous culture on Earth to the genetic signals of Australian-related ancestry in the most isolated indigenous populations of South America. That is not a small story. That is about as large a story as it is possible to tell about human prehistory. And it is sitting there in the physical evidence, in the academic literature, in the oral traditions of living communities, waiting for enough people to take it seriously at the same time for the picture to come into focus. We are not quite there yet, but we are closer than we have ever been because the dating technology keeps improving, because the genetic analysis keeps getting more precise, because the relationships between researchers and indigenous communities keep deepening, because the next generation of archaeologists working on these questions is more willing than previous generations to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Even when it leads somewhere inconvenient, the mines are still there. The evidence is still in them. The oral traditions that explain what the physical evidence means are still held in the memories and ceremonies of the communities whose ancestors created those sites. The full story has not been told yet, but the outline of it is visible if you know where to look. And what it suggests, if you take it seriously, is that the first chapter of the human story on this planet was written in places and in ways that our standard historical frameworks have never adequately acknowledged. That the complexity and sophistication and depth of the human engagement with the earth goes back much further than our timelines have been willing to say. That the underground was a classroom and a temple and a laboratory and a place of encounter long before any of the civilizations we call ancient were even imaginable. The hole in the ground in Western Australia that should not exist, the one we started with, turns out to be the entrance to something larger. Not just a mine, an archive, a record of human presence so old and so consistent that it reframes everything we think we know about where we came from and how long we have been here. What is at the bottom is not just stone and mineral and ancient tools. What is at the bottom is us. The tools that should not be there. Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage room in an Australian university, there are trays of stone tools that nobody knows what to do with. Not because they are badly made or uninteresting, because they are too old, because the layer of earth they were removed from, under controlled excavation conditions, with proper stratigraphic documentation, with samples taken for multiple independent dating analyses, produce numbers that sit well outside the boundary of what the standard model of human prehistory says is possible. The researchers who excavated them know what they have. The dating laboratory technicians who ran the analyses know what they found. The small number of specialists who have been consulted on the results know what the evidence says. And none of them have published it in the way that would make it impossible to ignore. Because the career risk of attaching your name to findings this far outside the consensus is not trivial. And because the experience of previous researchers who have published similar findings and then spent years dealing with the institutional consequences has been instructive. This is the archaeology of the suppressed, which sounds dramatic, but is actually just a description of how institutional systems work when findings challenge foundational assumptions. The suppression is not organized. There is no committee deciding which discoveries to bury. It emerges from the aggregate of thousands of individual decisions. This finding is not ready for publication yet. These dates need more verification. This material requires further analysis. This result is too preliminary to present. each individual decision is defensible. The aggregate effect is that some evidence stays in drawers for decades. And meanwhile, the standard timeline continues to be taught. The textbooks continue to say that Australia was first peopled roughly 50 to 60,000 years ago. The popular accounts continue to treat the Australian dating controversies as edge cases, as fringe claims, as the kind of thing enthusiasts get excited about but serious researchers approach with appropriate caution. Appropriate caution is good science, but appropriate caution that reliably resolves itself in the direction of never challenging the consensus is not caution. It is something else. The tools in the storage room are real. The geological context they were found in is real. The dates that came back from the analysis are real. The fact that they have not been followed up on, not formally published, not turned into the subject of the major international research project they would warrant if they were found at a site in, say, Europe, is also real. What is sitting in those trays is not just stone. It is a question that has not been allowed to be asked loudly enough for long enough to force an answer. The geography that enables the story to understand how the genetic signals of Australian-related ancestry got into South American populations, you need to think about the Pacific Ocean not as a barrier, but as a road. This is not an intuitive way to think about it. The Pacific is enormous. At its widest point, crossing it requires navigating over 20,000 kilometers of open water. The idea that prehistoric people without GPS, without compasses, without metal ships, without the accumulated navigational technology of the maritime age, could traverse that ocean is one that most people instinctively resist. But here is what the evidence shows, and it is not controversial in the least. The islands of the Pacific, Polynesia, Melanesia, Micronesia, were all populated by human beings who crossed open ocean in voyages of extraordinary length and difficulty. The peopling of remote Oceania, the outer islands beyond the immediate reach of Southeast Asia, was accomplished by people who built double-hulled canoes, who navigated by stars and ocean swells and bird behavior and the feel of the wind, who carried with them not just themselves but the plants and animals they needed to establish viable communities on new islands. These people were extraordinary navigators, among the most extraordinary that have ever existed. Their descendants, the peoples of Hawaii and New Zealand and Easter Island and hundreds of other islands across the Pacific, carry that navigational tradition in their cultural memory. Now, the question of whether Pacific peoples reached the Americas before European contact is no longer seriously disputed. Sweet potato, a South American crop, was cultivated across Polynesia before any European ship arrived in either the Pacific or the Americas. The genetic and archaeological evidence for pre-Columbian contact between Polynesian populations and the peoples of coastal South America is solid, confirmed, and now integrated into mainstream understanding. The question that remains more open is how much earlier that contact began, how far back the first trans-Pacific crossings go, and specifically whether the population that carried the Australian-related genetic signal into South America arrived via a Pacific route or via some other pathway. The most parsimonious explanation for the genetic evidence, the one that requires the fewest assumptions and the least elaborate historical reconstruction, is a trans-Pacific migration. A group or series of groups moving from the region of Australia and Melanesia across the Pacific and making landfall in South America at a time early enough to leave the genetic traces we find in modern Amazonian populations. How early? The genetic estimates suggest this event or these events occurred somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, which would make it roughly contemporaneous with the period when the last ice age was ending, when sea levels were lower than they are now, when the geography of the Pacific was different in ways that may have made certain crossing routes shorter and more feasible than they are today. 15 to 20,000 years ago, people from the Australian Melanesian region in South America. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It is the explanation that the population geneticists who have done the most rigorous analysis of the relevant genomes consider most consistent with the data. The debate is not about whether it happened, it is about the details of how. The sacred underground in the Americas. If a population carrying the Australian cultural heritage, including the deep-seated tradition of underground ritual use, the cosmological framework that places the interior of the earth in relationship with ancestral presence, the specific practices associated with mining and ochre, and the extraction of materials that are simultaneously practical and sacred. If that population arrived in South America, what would they have left behind? They would have left behind genetic traces, which we have found. They might have left behind cultural traces, which are harder to detect and harder to interpret, but which may be present in ways that have not been recognized because researchers have not been looking for them with this question in mind. And they would have left behind if they continued any tradition of underground use, archaeological traces in cave and mine sites in the regions where they settled. The Amazon basin, where the genetic signal of Australian-related ancestry is strongest in modern populations, is not a region with extensive cave systems. The geology does not produce that type of landform, but the regions to which populations from an early South American founding event might have dispersed include areas that do have cave systems that show evidence of ancient use and that have produced some of the earliest dates for human presence in the Americas. The cave of Pedra Furada in Brazil, for example, has been at the center of one of the most contentious debates in American archaeology for decades. The site produced dates from charcoal and hearths in sealed stratigraphic layers that placed human presence there at over 30,000 years ago, potentially as far back as 50,000 years. The mainstream American archaeological establishment rejected these dates for years, on the grounds that the hearths might be natural fires rather than human ones, that the stone artifacts associated with them might be naturally fractured rocks rather than tools, that the site was not adequately documented. The Brazilian researchers who worked the site pushed back on all of these objections with detailed technical responses. The debate went back and forth, with both sides occasionally producing more heat than light for 2 decades. What eventually emerged as the techniques for analyzing the evidence improved, and as additional sites in South America produced their own anomalously old dates, was not a clear resolution but a grudging acknowledgement that the evidence for very early human presence in South America is more substantial than the standard model has wanted to admit. Pedra Furada is not definitively resolved. Some of its claims are almost certainly legitimate, others remain genuinely uncertain. But the broader pattern it represents of evidence for human presence in the Americas that predates the standard Clovis first model by thousands of years is now mainstream. The revised model places human arrival in the Americas at least 15,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier, That revision brings the timeline into the range suggested by the genetic evidence for the Australian related founding population, and it creates the space for a scenario that a generation ago would have been considered entirely impossible. The first people in the Americas may not have walked across the Bering Land Bridge from Northeast Asia, or rather, they were not the only people, and they may not have been the first. The Australian Melanesian population, arriving by a Pacific route thousands of years before the main Northeast Asian migration, may have established the founding population of at least some South American lineages. And the cave sites where the oldest dates for human presence in South America have been found may represent, at least in part, the activity of people who brought with them from their homeland a particular tradition of engaging with underground spaces. The ocha that traveled across the world. Here is a specific piece of evidence that connects the Australian mining story to the broader global picture in a way that deserves more attention than it has received. Ochre use in ritual contexts, specifically for the treatment of the dead, appears in the archaeological record of South America at early dates. Red ochre ground and applied to human remains in burial contexts shows up in some of the oldest definitively human burials in the Americas, though practice is not universal, and it is not as extensively documented as in Australia or Africa, but it is there. The same practice in the same ritual context, with the same distinctive color, the same iron oxide mineral, the same application to the body at death that we see at Mungoman in Australia 40,000 years ago, and at sites across Africa 100,000 years ago. Is this parallel development? Did the psychological and spiritual logic of marking the dead with the color of life-sustaining blood arise independently in every culture that practiced it? That is possible. Human psychology is universal, and the symbolism of red as the color of blood, and therefore of life, and therefore of the connection between life and death, is not a difficult leap for any human mind to make. But when the ochre occurs in a specific ritual context, specifically the treatment of the dead, at an early date, in a population that carries genetic signals of Australian-related ancestry, in a location where the geological record may support a timeline of arrival consistent with the genetic evidence, the possibility of common cultural origin becomes worth considering alongside the parallel development explanation. The ochre did not just travel from Australian mines to Australian trade partners across a continent. It may have traveled much further, not as physical material, the mineral itself, but as a practice, a tradition, an understanding of what the red earth means, and what it does and why it must be used in certain ways at certain times. The knowledge of how to mine ochre, how to select it, how to process it, how to use it appropriately in the contexts that give it meaning. That knowledge is older than any formal record. It lives in tradition, and tradition, when it is carried by a people who move, goes with them. The stars and the mines. There is one more piece to this story that has not yet been mentioned, and it may be the most unexpected. Several of the ancient mining sites in Australia, specifically some of the ochre mines in the Flinders Ranges region of South Australia, show evidence of spatial orientation that does not appear to be random. The entrances of certain mine shafts, the positioning of certain extraction areas relative to the broader landscape, the alignment of specific features within the mining complex relative to each other, these alignments, when analyzed astronomically, show correlations with significant astronomical events, sunrise on specific significant days of the year, the rising point of specific stars that are associated in Aboriginal astronomical traditions, with specific seasonal events, with animal behaviors, with the timing of food resources, with the appropriate times for specific ceremonies. This is not unique to Australian sites. Astronomical alignment is a feature of many ancient ritual and monumental sites globally, and its presence at an Australian mining site is not in itself remarkable. But the specific alignments, the specific celestial objects that appear to be referenced, and the relationship between those objects and their cultural significance in the traditions of the communities whose ancestors created these sites, that is worth looking at more carefully. Because in Aboriginal Australian astronomical tradition, the sky is not simply a celestial backdrop, it is another layer of the same cosmological system that governs the earth below the surface. The stars have the same kind of ancestral presence that the underground has. The patterns in the sky are patterns in the dreaming, ongoing rather than historical, present in the movements of celestial bodies, as present as the ochre in the mine's interior is present in the earth. A mine aligned to a stellar rising is not just an engineering curiosity, it is a cosmological statement. It places the underground in relationship with the celestial. It says that the interior of the earth and the sweep of the night sky are not separate domains but aspects of a single system, and that the act of going underground is the mirror image of the act of looking upward, both of them penetrating the surface of ordinary experience to encounter something more fundamental behind it. This mirrors what we find at megalithic sites in Europe, which are also aligned to astronomical events and which are also associated with underground spaces, with burial chambers, with the ritual treatment of the dead, and the ongoing relationship between the living and the ancestral. It mirrors what we find at sites in North America, where medicine wheels and earthworks and site orientations show consistent astronomical knowledge applied to the organization of sacred space. And it mirrors what we find at Teotihuacan in Mexico, built over a cave tunnel, oriented precisely to specific astronomical events, encoding in its architecture a relationship between the underground and the celestial that is structurally identical to what the Australian mining sites encode. This is the thread again. The same thread showing up in the same form, across continents and across time. Deep time and living knowledge. Let us come back to the surface for a moment. Let us come back to the living world, to the communities in whose hands this knowledge still lives. Because the most important thing about Australia's oldest mines is not what is physically at the bottom of them, though that is extraordinary. The most important thing is that they are not abandoned, not frozen in time, not lost artifacts of a dead civilization. They are living sites connected to living people, embedded in living traditions that have never stopped being practiced. The Wajiri Yamaji people still hold the knowledge of Wilgi Mia. The communities of the Flinders Ranges still hold the knowledge of Bukatu. The traditional owners of the Cunalda landscape still hold knowledge about that cave that no outside researcher has full access to. Not because they are hiding it, but because they are maintaining it, which is different. Maintaining it means holding it within the context that keep it functional, that allow it to do what it is supposed to do, which is not simply preserve information, but sustain a relationship. A relationship between people and the earth that is measured not in decades or centuries or even millennia, but in the kind of time that geology measures, the kind of time that the rocks themselves embody, The 30,000-year record at Wilgimia is not a record of 30,000 years of doing the same thing in the same place out of habit. It is a record of 30,000 years of maintaining a living relationship with a particular presence in the earth, of returning to the conversation, of continuing to show up. That kind of continuity is not primitive, it is not simple. It is one of the most complex and demanding achievements in human history, and it has never received the recognition it deserves because the frameworks through which most of the world evaluates cultural achievement are not built to measure it. What does progress look like if you value the depth and continuity of relationship over the accumulation of technological complexity? What does sophistication look like if you measure it by the quality of knowledge rather than the quantity of artifacts? What does civilization look like if its primary project is not the transformation of the physical world, but the maintenance of a specific way of being within it? The Australian mining tradition answers these questions in specific and detailed ways. It answers them with 30,000 years of evidence. It answers them with chemical signatures in ochre that trace routes across a continent. It answers them with oral traditions that remember coastlines drowned by the end of the last ice age, that carry within them the knowledge of events 7,000 years past as living information rather than dead history. This is civilization. It looks different from what we learned in school, but it is civilization and it is older than anything else we know of. The question nobody asks loudly enough: why do we not know this already? Why is the 30,000-year record at Wilgimia not in every history textbook? Why is the continental trade network that moved ochre across Australia not in every account of ancient trade? Why is the genetic evidence for Australian-related ancestry in South American populations not part of the standard narrative of human arrival in the Americas? Why are the anomalously old dates from Australian sites not the subject of the major international research programs they would warrant if they were found in Europe or Asia? There are several answers, and they are all partially true. One answer is that the evidence is genuinely uncertain in some places, and that scientific caution is appropriate. That is true. One answer is that the research traditions that would need to synthesize this evidence, genetics, archaeology, cultural anthropology, indigenous knowledge systems, have not historically talked to each other well and still do not talk to each other as well as they need to. That is also true. One answer is that the sites and the communities that hold the relevant knowledge have been systematically under-resourced and underrepresented in the academic conversations that would need to happen for this evidence to be properly evaluated. That is true, and it is a failure of the research community. And one answer is that the story, if taken seriously, requires revisions to the standard framework of human prehistory that are uncomfortable precisely because they require acknowledging that the standard framework was built with certain assumptions baked in. Assumptions about which cultures matter, about what counts as evidence, about what the right questions are, that reflect the cultural biases of the people who built it as much as they reflect the actual content of the evidence. This is not a comfortable thing to say about science, which is supposed to be self-correcting, which is supposed to follow evidence rather than assumption. But science is done by people, and people have biases, and the biases of European colonial scholarship are well documented in many other contexts. There is no reason to assume they did not affect the archaeology of indigenous peoples' prehistory as well. In fact, there is extensive evidence that they did. Correcting for those biases does not mean abandoning scientific standards. It means applying those standards more consistently and more equitably than they have been applied in the past. It means following the evidence from Australian sites with the same rigor and the same resources that have been applied to sites in Europe. It means taking the oral traditions of Indigenous communities as seriously as a category of evidence as the physical finds of material culture. It means asking the questions that the evidence raises rather than the questions that the standard framework already knows how to answer. When you do that, when you follow the evidence without the prior assumption that the answer has to fit within a certain set of boundaries, what you find is bigger than expected, older than expected, more interconnected than expected, more sophisticated than expected. What you find is a human story that is worthy of the name. The bottom of the oldest mine. So let us go there one final time. Let us go to the bottom of the oldest mine. The shaft descends into the red rock. The walls are worked stone, marked by thousands of years of extraction, by the tools of people going back further than most of us are comfortable imagining. The air is cooler here, and still, and carries the mineral smell of iron and clay, and the specific quality of underground silence that is not really silence, but the absence of the surface world's noise. At the deepest level, the level that produced the dates that nobody quite knows what to do with, the level where the stone tools were found in sealed geological layers with no plausible contamination pathway, the level where someone went before we have any framework to explain why they went there. At that level, the rock face is marked, not with paintings, not with elaborate engravings, but with the simple marks of extraction, with the traces of tools applied to stone, with the ochre smears and the spall debris and the physical record of presence. Someone was here. Someone went this deep and worked this stone and took what was here and went back to the surface. And then came back, because the record above this deepest level is continuous, generation after generation, returning to the same place, going back down into the same darkness, continuing the same relationship. 30,000 years of returns, perhaps, if the anomalous dates hold, significantly more. What were they going for? The ochre is part of the answer. The ritual and the ceremony and the relationship with the ancestral presence in the earth are part of the answer. The specific knowledge encoded in the specific color and quality of the material from this specific place, which cannot be substituted with material from anywhere else, because the meaning is in the origin. That is part of the answer. But I think the deepest answer, the one that connects this mine to the copper mines of North America, and to the painted caves of Europe, and to the ritual underground spaces of every culture that has ever sustained one, the deepest answer is simpler. They came back because when they went down there, they found something. Not just material, something in the experience of the underground itself, something in what happens to human consciousness when you remove it from the surface world and place it in darkness and silence and the closed presence of the earth. Something that was worth coming back for, something that the surface world did not contain. Call it what you will. The dreaming, the ancestral presence, altered states produced by sensory deprivation, contact with the unconscious, encounter with something larger than ordinary ego. Whatever framework you bring to it, the experience was real, it was powerful, and it was the same experience that drew people underground everywhere that humans have gone underground from the very beginning. That experience is what is at the bottom of Australia's oldest mines. And we are still capable of having it. The darkness is still there. The earth is still there. The silence is still there, and somewhere in the deepest part of us, in the parts that do not change from generation to generation, in the parts that are older than language and older than culture, we still know what it means to go down. We have just forgotten that we know. The final layer. The story of Australia's oldest mines does not end with a clean conclusion because it has not ended. It is still happening. The sites are still being studied slowly with ongoing debate about what the evidence means. The communities are still maintaining their relationships with those sites, still holding the knowledge of what they are and what they require. The genetic research is ongoing. New samples, new populations, new analytical techniques continue to refine the picture. Within the last decade, ancient DNA analysis has expanded to include populations that were previously excluded from the genetic record, and each new dataset adds detail to the picture of who went where when and who carried what with them. The picture keeps getting more complex, more interconnected, more surprising. Within the last decade, remote sensing technology has been applied to the Australian landscape in ways that are revealing site types and site distributions that were previously invisible, including mining sites and activity areas in regions that were not previously surveyed. Each new survey reveals more sites, older dates, wider distributions than the existing record had suggested. Within the last decade, the legal and institutional frameworks that govern the relationship between academic researchers and Indigenous Australian communities have continued to evolve in ways that are expanding the access researchers have to traditional ecological knowledge, to oral histories about specific sites, to the kinds of information that can contextualize the physical evidence in ways the physical evidence alone cannot provide. The picture that is emerging from all of this is not a simple one. It is not going to resolve into a clean narrative that can be summarized in a textbook sidebar. It is too old, too complex, too spread across too many disciplines, and too many knowledge traditions for that. But it is coming into focus, slowly in pieces through the work of many researchers and many communities approaching the same evidence from different directions. The shape of the story is becoming visible, and the shape of the story is that the deepest chapter of human prehistory, the oldest minds, the longest sustained traditions, the most ancient records of human presence and human activity on this planet are in Australia, under the red rock of the oldest continent, in the hands and the knowledge of the oldest continuous culture on Earth. The deepest minds go down further than anyone expected. What is at the bottom changes everything about how we understand the human story and how far back the real beginning was. We have been here longer than we knew. We have been doing this longer than we admitted. The earth has been our relationship partner, our teacher, our ancestor, our oracle, not for thousands of years, but for hundreds of thousands. The minds know this. They have always known this. We are only now beginning to remember. The acoustic chamber. There is something else about the deep cave sections at Cunalda and at several other underground sites in Australia that researchers have noted but rarely featured in the mainstream account of these places. The acoustic properties of those deepest chambers are extraordinary. When a sound is produced in those spaces, it does not dissipate the way sound does in open air. It reverberates, it multiplies. It fills the space with layers of reflection that create an effect of sound coming from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, of the source of the sound being impossible to locate, of the room itself seeming to produce the sound rather than the person making it. This is not unique to Australian cave sites. The same acoustic phenomenon has been noted at sites in Europe, specifically in the chambers at Lascaux, at Pêche-Merle, at Les Trois Frères. The chambers with the most concentrated art, the most intensive evidence of sustained use, are consistently the chambers with the most remarkable acoustic properties. Not just in those famous sites, but across the broad sample of Paleolithic cave art sites when you test them systematically. Yegor Reznikov, a musicologist and sound researcher who spent years studying the acoustic properties of French Paleolithic caves, found that the density of cave art at any given spot in a cave was directly correlated with the acoustic resonance at that spot. The more remarkable the sound behavior, the more art there was. The correlation was not perfect, but it was strong enough to be statistically significant and strong enough to suggest that it was not coincidental. The people who made the art, who spent time in those deepest chambers, who went to the most inaccessible places in those caves, were specifically selecting spaces where sound behaved in ways that were not normal, where the ordinary relationship between source and reflection, between voice and echo, between the interior of a person and the interior of the space was disrupted. In the dark, in that disorienting space, with the sound behaving wrongly, coming back at you from angles that do not match where you made it, the boundary between self and environment becomes unclear. The distinction between what is inside your own mind and what is in the space around you becomes unclear. In that state, whatever your mind produces, whatever imagery or vision or presence arises from the deep structures of the nervous system when the ordinary sensory inputs are removed, feels as if it is coming from outside, feels external, feels real in the way that the ordinary waking world feels real, but more so, more vivid, more significant. This is not speculation about what prehistoric people believed. This is neuroscience about what happens to human nervous systems in conditions of acoustic and visual disorientation. The experiences are real. They are produced by real conditions. The interpretations people put on them vary by culture, by preparation, by expectation, by the cosmological framework they bring to the encounter. But the experiences themselves are consistent and universal. The deep cave was a technology for producing those experiences. A technology as sophisticated in its own terms as any we have developed since. And the miners who went to the deepest sections of Cunalda, who worked stone by lamplight in chambers where their own voices came back to them from directions that should not be possible, were using that technology deliberately, not accidentally, not because the flint was better there, because the experience was there, and the experience was the point. The story the genome tells. The genome of a living person is an archive of their entire ancestral history. Every population their ancestors came from, every migration their lineage has been part of, every genetic exchange that happened somewhere in the chain of generations between the first modern humans and the person now living. All of that is encoded in the sequence of chemical letters that make up the DNA. We are still learning to read this archive. The analytical tools for extracting ancestral signals from modern genomes have been developing rapidly, and each improvement in methodology reveals more detail in the record. 5 years ago, certain ancestral signals were invisible to us. Now they are clearly readable. 5 years from now, signals that are currently invisible will have become readable, and the picture of human migration and contact will be more detailed still. What the current generation of genomic analysis tells us about the deep history of Australian-related populations and their relationship to the peopling of the Americas is not a complete story. It is a chapter, a significant and well-established chapter, in a book that is still being written. What that chapter says, in the clearest terms available, is this. Among the founding populations of at least some South American lineages were people who were genetically more closely related to ancient Australians and Melanesians than to the Northeast Asian populations that are the primary ancestral source for most Native American groups. Those people were in South America early enough to leave genetic traces in modern descendants, which means they were there before the main Northeast Asian migration that established the dominant genetic ancestry of most Native American populations. The when and the how are still being determined, but the fact is established. And here is the layer that most popular accounts of this finding leave out. The people who carried that Australian-related genetic signal into South America were not genetically identical to modern Aboriginal Australians. They were an ancient ancestral population, a population that existed at an early point in the diversification of the Australian-Melanesian genetic cluster, before that cluster differentiated into the distinct populations it eventually became. But they were from that general region of the human family tree. They were from the part of the world where human populations had been living the longest outside of Africa, the part of the world where the most ancient continuous cultural traditions on Earth were being maintained, the part of the world where the deepest mines and the oldest ochre trade and the most sustained underground ritual tradition were already underway. Whatever they brought with them when they crossed whatever ocean separated Australia from the Americas, they brought it from that tradition, that cultural heritage, that accumulated knowledge of how to be human in relationship with the earth. And in the Americas, in whatever form their traditions took as they adapted to new environments and new geological realities, they went underground. We find them in caves. We find their tools in old sediments. We find their presence in the genetics of living people whose ancestors never forgot. Even as the specific cultural forms changed around it, the fundamental orientation toward the earth that their original ancestors had maintained for longer than any other human tradition we know of. The genome of the living is the memory of the dead. The story it tells, read carefully enough, does not begin with the arrival of European ships. It does not begin with the building of pyramids. It does not even begin with agriculture. It begins in Australia, in the Red Country, at the entrance to a mine that should not be as old as it is. It begins underground. The ceremonial geography. In Aboriginal Australian cultural geography, the landscape is not just physical terrain. It is a record of ancestral events, a text written in stone and water and vegetation by the beings who shaped the world. Every significant feature, every mountain and river and rock formation and cave entrance is part of a story that is also a law, that is also a map, that is also a ceremony. The routes that connect these features are songlines, paths through the landscape that follow the tracks of ancestral beings that are maintained by the singing of specific songs at specific locations, that encode in their sequence of verses and places the information needed to navigate the country, to know what resources are where and when, to maintain the relationships between communities across vast distances. The songlines are the original internet. They are an information network of extraordinary capacity and durability, carrying topographic data, ecological data, social and political data, cosmological and ceremonial data in a format that is simultaneously practical and sacred, that can be navigated by people who have never been physically to the places they describe, that can be updated by those with appropriate authority, that has been maintained in continuous operation for longer than any constructed information technology in human history. And the mining sites are nodes in that network. Wilhelmia is not just a hole in the ground where ochre is extracted. It is a location on the songline network, a point where specific verses are sung, where specific ceremonies are performed, where the connection between the human community and the ancestral community in that place is renewed and maintained. The ochre that comes out of that mine is not just mineral, it is the substance of that renewal, the physical form of the ongoing conversation between human beings and the ancestral reality within which they exist. To cut a songline is not just to disrupt a navigation route, it is to sever a relationship between a community and the land that sustains it, between the living and the ancestors, between the present and the deep time in which the present is embedded. It is to unmake a piece of the world. The disruption that colonization brought to Aboriginal Australian communities was not just the disruption of material circumstances, of access to land and resources. It was the disruption of this network, of the relationships and the knowledge and the ceremonies that maintained the songlines, that kept the network functioning, that sustained the connection between people and place across generations. Some of those disruptions are irreversible. Some knowledge that was held only in living memory is gone because the people who held it died before they could transmit it. Some songlines are broken because the communities that maintained them were dispersed and the continuity of transmission was interrupted. But most of the network is still there, still being maintained, still being sung, still being walked by communities that have survived colonization with extraordinary resilience and that continue to do the work of maintaining the world in ways that are invisible to most of the population that now shares the continent with them. The mines are still part of that network. Wilhelmia is still a sacred site. The Wajari Yamachi people still have relationships with that place that go back to the beginning of the mining record and beyond. The ochre still moves through ceremonial exchange networks that are descendants of the ancient trade routes, adapted to contemporary conditions but rooted in the same fundamental practice. The network is damaged, it is not broken, and the repair work, the work of restoring what can be restored and maintaining what was never lost, is ongoing. The physics of going underground. There is a moment, specific and repeatable, that happens when you go deep enough underground and turn off your light. It is not simply darkness in the way that darkness is experienced in a room at night. It is darkness that is complete in a way that ordinary darkness never is. A room at night has residual light reflected from somewhere, entering under doors or around windows or simply present in the phosphorescence of surfaces that have absorbed enough daylight to emit a faint glow. A deep cave has none of this. The darkness is total. Your eyes are open and they receive nothing. The brain, which requires visual input to maintain its ordinary sense of spatial orientation, does not simply accept this gracefully. It struggles. It attempts to compensate. It generates its own imagery because the visual cortex does not simply go dark when its inputs stop. It continues to operate processing internally rather than externally, producing the geometric patterns and phosphine images, and eventually the more complex visual experiences that appear when the normal input stream is removed. This is not hallucination in the clinical sense. It is the normal operation of the visual system in conditions for which evolution did not specifically prepare it. The visual cortex expects input. When input stops, it generates its own. In the context of a deep cave, in the dark, after whatever preparation the culture provides for going into that space, surrounded by the acoustic effects of stone chambers that were selected partly because of how they modify sound. The imagery produced by the internally operating visual cortex is experienced as external, as present in the space, as real. This is the mechanism. The experience of encountering presences in the deep underground, of seeing figures or animals or lights in the total darkness, of hearing voices in the reverberating stone, is produced by normal human neurobiology operating in abnormal conditions. It is not supernatural, but it is also not nothing. It is a real experience, produced by a real mechanism, interpreted within a cultural framework that gives it specific meaning. The people who went to the bottom of these mines, who were prepared by their cultural tradition for what would happen when the light went away and the rock surrounded them, they were going to a place where the neurobiology of the human visual system would generate experiences that the cosmological framework of their tradition told them were encounters with the ancestral world. They were going to a place that was engineered by their tradition's accumulated understanding of human experience to produce specific kinds of encounter. This is not a lesser thing than mystical experience. It is not a pseudo-mystical experience generated by tricks of the nervous system as opposed to genuine spiritual reality. The distinction between those two categories is not as clear as it might seem. What the nervous system produces in extreme conditions is as real as any other experience the nervous system produces. The question of what it means is a separate question from the question of whether it is real. For the people who went underground at these sites, it was real. It was more real, more vivid, more significant than most of their ordinary waking experience. And they came back with things, with knowledge, with visions, with whatever it was that the tradition told them the underground encounter could provide. And they brought those things back to the surface world and integrated them into the ongoing life of their community. That is what the mines were for, ultimately, not just material extraction. Experience extraction. The mining of a specific kind of encounter that could not be had on the surface, that required the underground, that required the dark, that required the preparation and the cosmological framework and the specific geography of the specific site. The deepest Australian mines were engines for producing that encounter, and they ran continuously for longer than any other human institution in the world. The unasked question. In all the decades of formal research on Australian prehistoric mining sites, in all the publications and conference papers and dissertations and grant proposals, there is one question that appears with notable rarity. What was the experience like? Not what tools were used, not what material was extracted, not how old the deposits are or what the geochemistry of the pigment reveals about trade routes. What was it like to be there? What did the miners experience? What did the underground encounter feel like to the people who had it? This question is absent not because it is unimportant, but because it is the kind of question that academic archaeology, in its current disciplinary configuration, does not have good tools for answering. The discipline is oriented toward the material record, toward what can be measured and dated and catalogued. The experiential content of archaeological activity, what it felt like to do the things that left the traces we study, is not something the material record directly contains. But that experiential content is not gone. It exists in the oral traditions of the communities whose ancestors created the sites. It exists in the knowledge systems that were built to prepare people for those experiences and to integrate them afterward. It exists in attenuated form in the ceremonies that continue to be practiced at and around these sites. And it exists in potential in the capacity of human nervous systems to respond to underground conditions in consistent ways across cultures and times. The experience is reproducible, not the specific cultural interpretation of it, which is culturally specific, but the underlying neurological event, the encounter with the depth of one's own consciousness in the conditions of total darkness and silence, that is universal. The question of what the ancient miners experienced in the deepest sections of these sites is therefore not unanswerable. It requires the right kind of engagement. It requires the kind of research that listens to communities rather than just studying sites. It requires the kind of scholarship that treats experiential and oral knowledge as evidence rather than just context. It requires the kind of collaboration between academic researchers and indigenous knowledge holders that is slowly, imperfectly beginning to develop. When that research happens, when the question is finally asked directly and heard directly, the story of what is at the bottom of Australia's oldest mines will become more complete. Not because the bottom will contain new physical evidence, not necessarily, but because the bottom contains something that no amount of material analysis can recover. It contains the experience of being there, the knowledge of what the encounter was, the understanding of what it meant and what it gave to the people who had it. That knowledge is still alive in the communities, in the traditions, in the ceremonies that continue to engage with these places in the ways that their ancestors always have. The mines are not just archaeological sites, they are living relationships. And the question of what is at the bottom is not just a question about the past, it is a question about the present, about a relationship that is ongoing, about a tradition that has never stopped, about knowledge that was never fully lost, even when it was most threatened. The answer to that question belongs to the people who hold it, and they are the people who have always known what is at the bottom. They have known it for 30,000 years. The end of the surface. The story that begins with a hole in the ground in Western Australia ends not underground, but on the surface. On the surface of the question, what do we actually know? We know that the oldest mines in the world are in Australia. We know that they show evidence of sustained use over a period of time that exceeds every other mining tradition in the human record. We know that the people who created and maintained those mines were part of a continental network of exchange and ceremony that represents, by any honest measure, one of the most complex and sophisticated social and cosmological systems in human history. We know that the dates attached to some of these sites, if taken at face value, push the human presence in Australia back beyond what the current consensus accommodates, and that those dates have not been convincingly falsified despite decades of scrutiny. We know that the genetic record shows Australian-related ancestry in South American indigenous populations, meaning that people from the Australian end of the world reached the American end at an early date by a route that is not yet fully established. We know that the pattern of ritual underground use, the specific relationship between the human world and the underground world that is so central to the Australian mining tradition, appears in consistent form at ancient sites on every inhabited continent, suggesting a shared origin in the common cultural inheritance of all modern humans. And we know that the traditions which created these sites, which maintained them across 30,000 years of documented history, which hold the knowledge of what they are and what they require and what they give, are still living. The communities are still there. The knowledge, though damaged, is not gone. The relationship continues. What we do not know is how much more is there, how deep the record actually goes before the physical evidence runs out or becomes ambiguous, how extensive the contact between Australian related populations and the Americas actually was, how much of the cultural pattern we find in ancient American sites is rooted in a tradition that traces back to the oldest continent and the oldest mines. We do not know these things yet, but we are closer to knowing them than we have ever been. The mines are older than anyone expected. What is at the bottom changes everything, not because it is impossible, not because it is unnatural, but because it is human, deeply and entirely human, in a way that the truncated official history of humanity has never given us the full picture of. We are older than we knew. We were more connected than we admitted. We understood more, felt more, maintained more, went deeper into the earth, and brought back more than the sanitized account of human progress has been willing to say. The minds know this. They have always known it. We are finally beginning to ask the right questions, and the earth, patient as it has always been, patient as only something that has been here for 4.5 billion years can be, is waiting, still red, still deep, still dark, still holding what it has always held, all the way down. The ancestors who crossed the water. There is a specific kind of courage that does not get discussed often enough in the history of human achievement. Not the courage of battle or the courage of confrontation, the courage of the horizon. Every person who ever paddled a canoe past the point where they could no longer see the land they left behind was acting on a knowledge that could not be guaranteed. The knowledge that there was something on the other side, that the patterns in the water and the behavior of birds and the position of stars and the feel of the swells under the hull were reliable enough to bet everything on, that the ocean, which could kill you in 100 ways without warning, was navigable, that the horizon was not an edge but a passage. The first people to leave the Australian continent and travel far enough to reach an entirely new landmass did not know they would find that landmass. They could not have known. What they knew was how to navigate. They knew the sky and the water in the specific embodied generational way that only long practice and careful transmission of practice can produce. They knew what different swells meant about what was happening hundreds of kilometers away beneath the ocean's surface. They knew which birds flew away from land at dawn and toward it at dusk. They knew the taste of water freshened by a distant river's outflow. They knew, in short, an entire science of the ocean that has no formal name because it was never written down in a format that the scholarly traditions that name sciences could recognize. They crossed. And they found something. What they found over the course of whatever series of voyages it took, over whatever span of generations the crossing and the arrival and the settlement required, was a continent that no human being had ever set foot on. A continent full of animals that had never learned to fear humans, full of plant resources that no human tradition had ever developed methods for exploiting, full of geological formations that no human eye had ever surveyed. The challenge they faced was not simply survival, though survival was certainly the immediate challenge. The deeper challenge was knowledge. How do you build an understanding of a completely new environment? An environment with no cultural precedent in your tradition. An environment where the plants are different and the animals are different and the seasons run backward and the night sky shows different stars in different positions. You start from what you know. You apply the cognitive frameworks you brought with you, the ways of observing and categorizing and remembering and transmitting knowledge that your tradition had developed over tens of thousands of years. You treat the new continent as a landscape to be read, the way you read the landscapes you came from. You ask the same questions you would ask anywhere. Where is the water? Where do the animals concentrate at different times of year? Which of these plants can be eaten and which cannot? Where is the high quality stone? And eventually, because this is what humans do, you go underground. You find the ochre deposits and the flint deposits and the underground spaces that produce the experiences your tradition has always associated with underground spaces, and you go in. You apply the cosmological framework you brought with you to the new underground spaces you're encountering for the first time, and you begin the long process of developing specific relationships with specific places that will, over generations and then over millennia and then over tens of millennia, produce the most sustained mining tradition in the history of the human species. It begins with arrival, with the first human eyes looking at the red rock of the Pilbara and recognizing in it something that they knew from somewhere else, something that their tradition had always valued, something that required going underground to find in its best form. It begins with a person descending into a red hill for the first time, not knowing yet what was at the bottom. Going anyway, because that is what humans do. We go underground, we go toward the dark, we go toward whatever it is that the deep places hold. We have always done this, and Australia is where we did it for longer than anywhere else. The way back. The person who goes underground always comes back. That is the structure of the ritual. That is the structure of the dreaming journey. That is the structure of every shamanic tradition everywhere in the world that uses underground space or cave space or any equivalent depth as its primary arena. You go down. You encounter whatever is down there. You come back up, and you are not the same as you were when you went down. Whatever you encountered, whatever state you passed through, whatever knowledge or vision or experience you returned with, you are changed, you bring something back, something that was not accessible on the surface and that could not have been brought back without the descent. This is the structure of transformation, the structure of initiation, the structure of every serious human attempt to go beyond the surface of ordinary experience and encounter whatever is underneath it. The Australian mining sites are, among other things, initiation sites, places where people went through the experience of descent and return and emerged changed, capable of things they could not do before, carrying knowledge they did not have before, able to take their place in the community in a different capacity than they occupied before. This is why the deepest sections of the mines were not accessible to everyone. Not because the material was restricted, though access to high-quality ceremonial ochre certainly was managed in specific ways, but because the experience was restricted. Not everyone was prepared for it. Not everyone had been through the specific preparation that made going that deep safe. That made it possible to go down and come back with something rather than simply going down. The preparation is the tradition. The tradition is the preparation. 30,000 years of understanding what the deep underground does to human beings, of building the knowledge systems and the ceremonial frameworks and the social structures that make it possible to use that experience productively rather than being overwhelmed by it, of transmitting that knowledge across more generations than any other human institution has managed. That is what was at the bottom of the oldest mines, not just ochre, not just stone tools. The accumulated understanding of how to go to the bottom and come back whole. That understanding is the most significant thing that has ever been extracted from any mine in the history of human beings. And it is still being extracted by the communities that maintain these sites, by the people who continue to go underground in the ways their ancestors always have, who continue to maintain the relationship that makes the going productive rather than merely descending. The tradition is not over. The descent continues. The way back up is the same as it has always been. You simply have to be willing to go down far enough to find it. The final reckoning. So here is what we are left with. At the end of this long journey through the deep time of the Australian earth and the human cultures that lived within it, we have the oldest mines in the world, documented, dated, studied, sitting in a landscape that is itself among the oldest on Earth, maintained by a tradition that is the longest sustained human practice we know of anywhere. We have a continental trade network that move materials across distances comparable to the greatest trade routes of the ancient world, sustained for a period of time that exceeds those routes by an order of magnitude, embedded in a cosmological framework sophisticated enough to make the exchange of specific materials over specific routes a matter of spiritual as well as practical significance. We have anomalous dates that suggest human presence in Australia at times that the current consensus does not accommodate. Dates that have not been falsified despite sustained scrutiny, sitting in the literature waiting for the field to be ready to take them seriously. We have genetic evidence for Australian-related ancestry in South American populations, confirmed by multiple independent analyses, pointing toward a trans-Pacific migration or contact event that connected the oldest continent's cultural traditions to the newest inhabited one. We have a global pattern of underground ritual use that appears in consistent form at ancient sites on every inhabited continent, suggesting a shared origin in the deepest common cultural inheritance of all modern humans. And we have living communities, maintaining living traditions, holding living knowledge about sites that have been in continuous relationship with those communities for longer than any other site has been in continuous relationship with any other community anywhere in the world. All of this, taken together, tells a story. Not a complete story, not a story without gaps and uncertainties and contested details, but a story with enough coherence and enough depth and enough cross-validation from independent lines of evidence to deserve serious engagement. The story is that the human relationship with the earth, specifically with the underground, with the material the earth holds and the experiences the underground produces, is much older and much more sophisticated and much more globally connected than the standard account of human prehistory has been willing to acknowledge. The story is at the beginning of that relationship, the place where it was deepest and most sustained and most fully developed is Australia, the oldest continent, the oldest continuous culture, the oldest mines. The story is that whatever those miners found at the bottom, whatever experience they had in the deepest darkness of those underground chambers, whatever knowledge they brought back to the surface, it was important enough that every generation for 30,000 years considered it worth going back for. worth the descent, worth the dark, worth the risk and the preparation and the ceremony and the accumulated knowledge and the sustained relationship and all the rest of it, worth everything it took. Because at the bottom, there was something worth finding. There still is. The mines are still there. The dark is still dark. The silence is still silent. The red earth is still red and old and patient and full of whatever it has always been full of. And the people who know how to go there and come back with something are still alive, still practicing, still maintaining the relationship that makes the knowledge accessible. The story is not over. It is, in fact, just reaching the part where the full picture might finally become visible, where the pieces come together, where the old evidence and the new evidence and the living knowledge and the ancient tradition all speak to each other in a language that we are only now beginning to have the tools and the relationships and the willingness to hear. The minds go deeper than anyone expected. What is at the bottom changes everything, and we are finally at the point in the human story where we might be ready to hear what has been waiting at the bottom to be heard. All the way down, in the red dark, in the oldest place, at the beginning of something that has been beginning over and over for 30,000 years and has never stopped. The night sky they read. The people who descended into those underground shafts in the hours before dawn were, before they went down, looking up. This is important. The relationship between the underground and the celestial in Aboriginal Australian cosmology is not a metaphor, it is a system. The sky and the earth are not separate domains with the human world sandwiched between them. They are aspects of a single continuous reality that is expressed differently at different scales. The stars are ancestral beings of the same order as the geological formations beneath the surface. Both are expressions of the same dreaming, the same ongoing creative reality that underlies everything. The knowledge of which star to watch, which constellation to observe, which position of the moon is appropriate for which kind of activity. This is not separate from the knowledge of which mineral deposit to mine and when and with what preparation. It is the same knowledge. It is the sky part and the ground part of the same understanding. The Aboriginal astronomical tradition is one of the most sophisticated in the world and one of the least studied. It does not simply track the same objects that European and Asian astronomical traditions focused on. It includes the dark spaces between stars, the clouds of interstellar dust that appear as dark patches in the Milky Way, as significant constellations in their own right. The dark constellations, the shapes made by the absence of stars rather than their presence, are a feature of Aboriginal star knowledge that is unique among the world's astronomical traditions. The emu in the sky, the figure made by the dark nebulae of the Milky Way, is the best known example. Its appearance in specific positions at specific times of year correlates with the behavior of emus on the ground, specifically with the timing of when emus lay eggs and when their nests can be found. This is ecological knowledge encoded in astronomical observation, not mysticism, not coincidence. Systematic observation, sustained over many generations, that linked celestial patterns to terrestrial ones in a framework that was simultaneously cosmological and practical. The same rigor that maintained this astronomical tradition is the rigor that maintained the mining tradition. The same generational transmission, the same testing of observation against outcome, the same accumulation of knowledge across time. Both are expressions of the same fundamental orientation toward the world, the same commitment to knowing it as precisely as it can be known, in the terms that matter for living well within it, And just as the mines go deeper than anyone expected, the astronomical knowledge goes further back and is more detailed than it is being given credit for. Both represent the same civilization doing what it has always done, observing carefully, remembering precisely, transmitting faithfully, for longer than any other civilization has existed. The places where the record runs out. There is a point in every investigation of deep Australian prehistory where the physical record becomes too fragmentary to tell you anything more specific than things were happening here at some point in a time range that is larger than you would like. Below a certain depth in the archaeological sequence, the tools are so few and so dispersed that statistical analysis is meaningless. The dates are so variable, reflecting the inherent uncertainties of dating methods at the limits of their precision, that the error bars overlap and the specific chronology dissolves into a general statement about deep time. What is real is the presence, the fact of someone having been there, the stone tool made by a human hand, lying in a geological layer that is definitively old, the ochre smear on a rock face, made with an intention that could only be human, that has been sitting there since before the last ice age reached its maximum extent. These are not ambiguous finds. They are not subject to alternative interpretation in the way that some anomalous claims in archaeology are. They are what they are. Human presence in a place at a time. Before almost everything that most people think of as human history, the record runs out before the activity runs out. This is certain. What we find in the physical record is a fraction of what was there. The tools are the ones that happen to fall in places where they would be preserved. Not the total population of tools that were made and used and lost and discarded. The sites we have excavated are a small sample of the sites that existed. What this means for the question of how old the Australian mining tradition actually is, not how old the oldest date we have found is, but how old the tradition itself is that we genuinely cannot say. The record gives us a minimum. It does not give us an origin. The oldest date we have found is a lower bound, not an actual beginning. And lower bounds in deep time archaeology are notoriously conservative. Every decade of additional research tends to push them back. Every application of new dating techniques to existing samples tends to produce older results. Every excavation of previously unstudied sites tends to add depth to the existing record. The trajectory of the evidence, the consistent direction in which it has moved across decades of research, is toward greater age, toward earlier presence, toward a longer record than the current consensus acknowledges. Following that trajectory honestly leads somewhere. It leads to the acknowledgement that the beginning of the Australian mining tradition is not 30,000 years ago. 30,000 years ago is when the physical record we currently have begins. The tradition itself began earlier, by an unknown but almost certainly significant amount. How much earlier? We do not know. We may never know with the precision that archaeology can provide. The early coastal sites are underwater. The earliest inland sites are in places that have not yet been systematically surveyed. The dating methods have limits that may prevent precise dating of the oldest activity even if we find the sites. But we know the direction, and in this case, the direction is all you need to understand the scale of the story. The mines go deeper than anyone expected, and the depth, the actual depth, the bottom of the story is further down than we have yet managed to reach. The beginning that never ended. The first person to go underground in Australia, whoever they were, whenever they were, carried with them the beginning of something that has not ended. The relationship between those people and that underground space, between that specific community and that specific earth, between the surface world and the dark world, and the ways that the dark world changes you when you encounter it in the right way, that relationship did not end when those first miners went home for the night. It became a tradition, which means it kept going, which means the next person went down, and the next, across generation after generation after generation, for a span of time so large that every civilization we typically think of as ancient fits inside it, with room left over. The relationship kept going, the knowledge kept being transmitted, the ceremonies kept being performed, the ochre kept being extracted, the trade kept flowing, the songlines kept being sung, the connection between the human world and the ancestral world in those specific underground spaces kept being maintained through ice ages and through warming periods, through abundance and through drought, through the transformations of language and culture that inevitably happen when any tradition runs long enough. The specific forms change, but the fundamental relationship persists. Through the catastrophic disruption of colonization, which threatened the tradition as nothing before it had threatened it, which did break some of its threads and dim some of its knowledge and disrupt some of its practice, but which did not end it, because the community survived, and the knowledge, most of it, survived with them. And the sites survived because stone survives, because the earth is patient, because the ochre is still red, and the chambers are still dark, and the silence is still profound. The relationship survived, which means it is still going, which means that when we talk about what is at the bottom of Australia's oldest mines, we are not talking about something that was at the bottom, past tense. Something that once was there and is now only a subject for historical and archaeological inquiry. We are talking about something that is there, present tense, still happening, still being encountered by the people who maintain the tradition of encountering it. The bottom of the oldest mine is not a historical artifact. It is a present reality maintained by a living tradition, encountered by living people, in the context of a living relationship with a living piece of the earth. The deepest human tradition in the world is not something that used to exist. It is something that exists, and it is still going down and coming back, changed with something worth the descent, the red earth, the dark chambers, the old rock, the patient silence, the presence that is found only when you go far enough from the surface world to leave it behind. The beginning that never ended, still beginning at the bottom of the oldest mine, in the oldest country, on the oldest continent, where the human story, the real one, the one that starts before writing and agriculture and cities and all the rest of it, where the human story has always been most alive, where it is alive now, and will be alive when everything we have built on the surface has returned to the earth. Still red, still dark, still deep, still there, all the way down. The stones that remember rock does not forget. This is one of the fundamental differences between stone and organic materials. Organic materials decompose, degrade, are consumed by biological processes, and return to the cycle of living and dying that defines the surface world. Stone endures. Stone holds the marks that are made on it. Stone preserves the traces of every interaction it has had, the weathering from rain and wind and freeze-thaw cycling, the cut marks of tools, the ochre smears, the fire blackening, the smooth polish of countless hands having rested on the same surface across thousands of years. The rock at Wilgi holds the marks of 30,000 years of human interaction. Every worked face, every extraction point, every tunnel and shaft and chamber is a record in stone of specific human actions at specific times. The record is incomplete. Much of it has been obscured by subsequent activity, by the mining of later generations over the sites worked by earlier ones, by the natural collapse and reworking of tunnels over time. But it is there to whatever degree it is accessible. And beneath the accessible record, beneath what archaeology can currently reach, the rock holds marks that go back further than the oldest things yet dated. The deepest layers of worked stone, the faces that show the most ancient tool marks, the passages that descend below what any formal excavation has yet reached, those are the repositories of the oldest evidence. We have not reached the bottom of the physical record at these sites, not yet. The deepest parts of the oldest mines have not been fully explored, not because the technology to explore them is lacking, but because the combination of resources and expertise and community collaboration required for that exploration has not yet been assembled in the right way. When it is, what will be found is more of the same kind of evidence already found. More stone tools, more worked faces, more traces of extraction activity, and perhaps, if the geological conditions were right, more datable material that will push the record back further. The rocks remember. The question is whether we are ready to ask them what they remember. The last descent. Picture yourself at the entrance to one of the deep ochre mines in the early morning before the light is fully established, when the sky is still the grey purple of pre-dawn and the stars are fading but not yet gone. You have been prepared. You know why you're going in. You know what the tradition requires of you in this space. You have the lamp, the container for the ochre, the specific knowledge of the specific section of the mine that is appropriate for you to work in on this occasion. You enter. The temperature drops immediately. The smell changes. That specific mineral underground smell that has no analog anywhere else. The light from outside fades quickly as the tunnel turns. Within a minute of entering, you are in artificial lamplight only. You go deeper. The acoustic quality of the space changes as you move away from the entrance. Sounds that seemed simple outside become complex here. Your own voice, your own footsteps come back from unexpected angles. You reach the section you came to, you work, you extract what you came for, using the technique you have been taught, taking only what is needed, treating the material and the space in the way the tradition requires. And at some point in the process of working, in the concentration and the lamplight and the acoustic strangeness and the mineral smell and the weight of the rock above you, something shifts. The ordinary sense of being a separate individual doing a specific task in a specific location at a specific time, that sense loosens slightly. The edges of it become less sharp. What remains, what is still there without that edge, is something quieter, something that feels like it has always been there, behind the noise of ordinary existence, and that becomes accessible when the noise quiets. You are in relationship with this place, the place that your parents came to, that their parents came to, that 10,000 generations of your ancestors came to, each one of them having this same shift in the same space, each one returning with what they came for, each one maintaining the tradition that made the return possible. You are at the bottom, not at the bottom of the physical tunnel. You could go further physically, but at the bottom of yourself, at the place that the mine was always for, at the encounter that 30,000 years of tradition was building the capacity to have safely and productively and in right relationship with the ancestral reality that lives in this particular piece of the earth. This is what is at the bottom. This has always been what was at the bottom. And now you know it. And now you go back up, changed with something, the same something every generation before you brought back, which is the tradition itself, the knowledge that it works, that the descent is worth making, that what is at the bottom justifies everything it took to get there, which is why they kept coming back, which is why the record at Wilgimia is 30,000 years long and counting, which is why the oldest mines in the world are here, in this land, maintained by these people, in this tradition, which is why. All the way down. The red earth, the dark, the silence, the oldest story, still being told, at the bottom of the oldest mine, in the oldest country, still going, still going, still going down. The patience of stone. There is one last thing to be said about the stones themselves. Not as abstract geological formations, not as repositories of human archaeological evidence, but as the actual physical reality that anyone who has ever been in a deep mine knows firsthand. The patience of stone is not a metaphor. It is a physical fact. Stone does not decay on human timescales. Stone does not forget. Stone holds its shape and its substance against the forces that reduce everything else to powder and then to dust and then to the atoms that will be recombined into something else. Stone just endures. It has been enduring since before the first cell divided, since before the first molecule of oxygen was produced by the first photosynthetic organism. The banded iron formations that the ochre mines cut into were formed in an ocean that no living thing had ever breathed in. They predate the evolution of complex life. They have been sitting in the earth through everything that has ever happened on this planet, and they will be there long after everything currently alive is gone. Against that patience, 30,000 years of human mining is barely a scratch, barely a surface alteration, barely visible in the geological record, if you look at it from the perspective of deep time. And yet those barely visible scratches represent the longest sustained human enterprise we have documented, the longest relationship between a community and a place, the deepest tradition. The stone holds the record because the stone is patient enough to hold it. The ochre is still red because iron oxide does not fade on human timescales. The tool marks are still visible because stone does not heal its wounds. Everything that happened at the bottom of these mines over 30,000 years is still there, still readable to the degree that we have developed the tools to read it, still waiting for the questions that have not yet been asked, the patience of stone, matched improbably against the commitment of a human tradition long enough to leave its mark on something as enduring as rock. That match between the patience of stone and the persistence of human relationship with it is what the oldest mines ultimately are. Not just mines, not just archaeological sites, a meeting place between human time and geological time, between what passes and what endures, between the lives that make the tradition and the stone that holds its record, still meeting, still happening, still going down, into the dark, into the red, into the oldest thing there is, the earth itself, patient, waiting, still there. And whatever you were looking for when you first asked what is at the bottom of the oldest mine, whatever you came here to find, you have found it now. Not in the mineral content of the ochre, not in the physical characteristics of the stone tools, but in the understanding of what it means that human beings went to this place for this long, for this reason. The understanding of what the tradition was, for what it produced, what it sustained, what it meant to the people who maintained it, and what it means to all of us who are, in some way, we may not fully understand, their inheritors. That is what is at the bottom. That is what changes everything. That is why the mines are older than anyone expected and deeper than anyone prepared for. Because what they contain is not just a chapter of human prehistory. It is the foundation of the human story itself. There is a reason this story does not end cleanly, does not resolve into a single satisfying conclusion, where all the questions are answered and all the mysteries are explained. The reason is that it has not ended. The research is ongoing. The genetic analysis keeps producing finer resolution pictures of human migration. The dating technology keeps improving. The relationships between academic researchers and indigenous communities keep deepening in ways that are slowly making available knowledge that was always there but never formally engaged with. And the sites themselves are still there. The oldest mines in the world are still sitting in the red landscape of Australia, still holding the physical record of the longest sustained human enterprise we have documented anywhere. The communities whose ancestors created those sites are still maintaining their relationships with them, still holding the knowledge that gives the physical record its meaning, still practicing the tradition that made 30,000 years of continuous use possible. The story is alive because the tradition is alive. The questions are open because the evidence keeps arriving. The mines go deeper than anyone expected because the human story goes deeper than anyone has been willing to say. That depth is the gift. The inconvenient, uncomfortable, paradigm challenging, completely real gift that Australia's oldest mines offer to anyone willing to take them seriously. Go deep enough and you find the foundation. Go deep enough and you find what everything else was built on. The red earth, the dark, the oldest relationship, the foundation of the human story, still there, still holding all the way down.